Hello, my name's Ian Smith and I'm here to introduce you to the Organic Chemistry Lab. This short slideshow provides a brief introduction together with some guidance on things you need to know before starting your Chem200 labs. Now, since you will have your own personal equipment drawers for the coming term, you'll have to visit the lab to check in, where the lab technician will provide you with your locker keys and explain a little bit about the specialised glassware used in the organic chemistry lab. He may also give you some basic information on lab protocol. Now, it's important for you to attend the lab for check-in on the dates and times given here, otherwise you'll not be able to continue with the lab component of the course. You also need to view this entire presentation before attending your first scheduled experiment, Physical Properties, which begins on the week given in this presentation. As we get underway in this presentation, a reminder that starting with your first scheduled experiment, you must always wear approved eye protection and lab coats in the organic chemistry lab. Secondly, personal communication devices such as cell phones, smartphones, iPods and such like are not allowed to be used in the lab. You should see your lab manual and lab schedule for more details on those restrictions. There are some things which you must bring to your first scheduled experiment, and these include the current edition of your lab manual, a suitable lab notebook, adequate eye protection, and a lab coat. All of these items can be purchased from the university bookstore. The lab schedule for the fall term is shown here. A copy of the schedule will be provided at your check-in session, and it can also be viewed on our Instructional Resources website. Now, at the check-in session, you'll be asked to fill in the form on page 15 of your lab manual, sign and date the form, and hand it in. Note that by signing this form, you're stating that you have both read and understood the lab regulations, and you'll find those lab regulations in Appendix 1 of your lab manual. The pink sheet shown here is a brief questionnaire which you may be given and asked to fill in at the same time. Again, you're reminded that you won't be allowed to work in the lab without first having completed lab check-in with the technician. If you attended your first scheduled Chem200 lecture, you would have been provided with a copy of this memo, which details most of which we have just covered here, together with important information on what you should do to prepare yourself for your first lab. If you don't have a copy of this memo, it's also available on our Instructional Resources website. On the back of this memo, you'll find information on what you need to do before attending your first lab session, Physical Properties. And this lab session actually extends through 2 lab sessions. It's important that you read this information and follow through on all the directions. You must be adequately prepared for both sessions of Physical Properties at the beginning of the first session. Some basic guidelines are given here on how you should prepare your lab notebook for each experiment. Read your lab manual for more details. Your notebook should contain a preliminary write-up for each experiment, and this includes the experiment title, the date, and a brief statement of the experiment's objectives. You should also tabulate all relevant physical constants, in other words, all physical constants which you will need to know to successfully complete the experiment. Don't forget to also cite all sources used to obtain the information. The very best way of recording this information is, as shown here, by tabulating it. Showing the information in a ruled table makes it much easier to locate it in the future. Finally, after reading through the experimental details, you should decide on what data is to be recorded during the course of the experiment. Do you have to weigh a chemical? Is it important for you to know the amount you weighed or the volume you measured? Do you have to weigh the chemical into a pre-weighed container, or do the instructions tell you to tear the container beforehand? If a pre-weighed container is needed, then its mass needs to be recorded. All of this you should decide before the experiment begins and prepare tables accordingly for recording all raw data. The preferred method is to tabulate the data as shown here with ruled lines, since again it highlights the information and makes it easier to locate when needed. The preparation you have in your notebook will be checked at the beginning of your lab session, and marks will be awarded which contribute to the overall mark for your lab report. So please do your notebook presentation before you attend the lab, otherwise you won't be able to receive the marks for it. Now, once you have started the experiment and during the experiment, you should enter all your data together with any observations directly into your lab notebook. All changes to errors in recording data must be initialed by me or the technician before you leave the lab that day. Never use scrap paper for recording anything in the lab. Record it all in your notebook. Although you're allowed to enter calculations in pencil, you must always record data and observations in blue or black ink. Never tear out pages from your notebook. That's not allowed. Any notebook entries which you no longer want to use should simply be scored out with a single line. Once the experiment is finished, you'll need to enter or transfer information to the relevant report sheet. Report sheets for each experiment are provided in your lab manual. Once the report sheet is complete, it should be submitted for marking. Any prepared lab samples should also be properly labelled and submitted along with your report. And once your report has been marked, it will be returned to you. Once you've had an opportunity to see your marked report and, if necessary, ask any questions about it, it must be given back. Marked reports are not allowed to be removed from the lab. Now, a quick word here about late reports. The chemistry department has a strict policy on the consequences of handing in late lab reports. You can read more about it on a separate handout, but essentially, if a lab report is up to 24 hours late, you will lose 50% of the total possible marks for that report. If the lab report is more than 24 hours late, you'll lose all marks for that lab report. So please remember that it's your responsibility to submit your reports as requested by your lab supervisor in the proper place and by the given deadline. And now some information about attendance. You're expected to attend all scheduled lab sessions. These sessions have been organised on the assumption that you will be adequately prepared, so please familiarise yourself on what you need to do to properly prepare yourself for the lab sessions. Once in the lab, you should have a good sense of what tasks lay ahead and to budget your time so that those tasks can be achieved in the time available to you. The very nature of preparative organic chemistry requires very often for us to wait some time before we can evaluate or prepare samples by, say, obtaining quantitative information such as sample mass, or qualitative information such as obtaining some physical properties, melting point, refractive index, and so on, or even spectral information. In some cases, such work has to be done outside of your regularly scheduled lab hours, where you would visit the lab and perform measurements such as those listed here. Such measurements, melting point, refractive index, weighing, even obtaining an infrared spectrum, involve just a very short time, say no more than 10 to 15 minutes. For this after-hours work, we have set aside times during which you can pay a short visit to the lab to complete these measurements. A notice, like the one shown here, will be posted at the lab entrance in the hallway, showing times during which the lab is available for use. During most of those times, you will be supervised by the lab technician. And during these after-hours times, you must always access the lab via a first-year lab, usually FIR 306, and ring the doorbell if the door is locked. There are strict parameters which govern your access to the lab outside your scheduled times, and the lab technician will discuss this with you at the check-in session. Now, finally, you must have my permission to visit the lab outside of your regular lab hours. I will always advise you whether such work is necessary or not. As this presentation draws to a close, I just want to remind you of the Pure and Applied Sciences policy on missed labs and exams, and what you must do if you miss a lab. This information is available on our website and in your course outline, so please familiarise yourself with it. Here, we do what we do at the beginning of term with all lab classes. We ask you to be aware that the university has a strict policy on cheating and plagiarism, and that you should review this policy both in your course outline and in the university calendar. As far as your labs go, please be reminded of some of the examples of what constitutes cheating, given here, together with the consequences. I ask that you all follow what I like to call the honour principle during the course of your labs. And that is that you are on your honour to do the right thing and to not be tempted to do the wrong thing. Reporting in science has to be honest. It has to be based on truth. You must always report what actually happened and what your results actually were. Please never give in to the temptation to report what you would like to have happened or what you would have liked your results to be. We all make mistakes, and experiments never always go according to plan. Reporting the truth, good or bad, is far better than reporting lies. Students will never receive a 0 mark for reporting the truth, even when the experiment goes wrong. Students will always receive a 0 mark for cheating. Finally, some reminders about your first lab on physical properties. And if you have any questions before your first lab, please send me an email.